Okay, going forward then to actually add the CRUD operations. Oh, by the way, that's that missing association there between the page as a XAML object and the code behind event, the event and the code behind. That's why it didn't work to show employees. I copied and pasted the code into the code behind without actually creating the event, which was silly of me. All right, well, let's leave that alone for now. I just wanted to point out that I did make that change from the posted solution. I'm going to start back here in our our code behind page for the app object, right? Now remember, we were doing sort of a poor man's approach here, utilizing this as sort of a place to store information that we might want to get from more than one place. To do this kind of CRUD operation, I would find it awfully difficult to try and do everything in one page, right? We aren't talking about a spa here, single page application. So odds are I'm going to navigate from my main page, which we have set up to list the employees right now, to a page where I'll probably focus on the details for one employee at a time. As I do so, this isn't critical. I could just reload the departments again, but if I already have them downloaded, it's the kind of thing that why would I ask for it over the internet every time I just jump back and forth between pages, right? True, you possibly could be editing departments, in which case you could get out of sync here until you take some action to fix that, but for the most part, that's not the kind of thing. It's kind of like the province list, right? That's even a more extreme example, because the frequency with which we change the names of provinces in the country is even less than we might change the names of the departments. But for the most part, it's probably efficient to just store this once we've downloaded it once. So I'm going to throw one extra little bit of stuff here. Remember, we threw this in the other day so I could access the URI from my WebApi service from anywhere. So I'm going to throw in here just a list that I'm going to call active departments, right? Of course, I haven't ever added the using for the models folder, so quick control period will get that. There we go. All right. So what I'm going to do is once I download it from the initial page, the main page, I'll store it in here. That way I can just go back and forth, and when I flip between pages, I don't have to keep refreshing this almost static or fairly static list every time, right? I'm not going to worry too much about putting property change notifications in to have it automatically refresh. I'm just going to live with it the way it is to keep things simple for now. But while we're here, hey, how many times have I said that? While we're here, there's a couple other things I want to throw in. I would often actually, again, in a full-blown solution, create like some helper classes where this would probably go. But because I'm trying to do this in a hurry, and it works perfectly from the app code behind page as well, I'm just going to throw in a couple of methods to help me with certain things I'm going to use over and over again in multiple situations. You've seen already that the way to show messages in a universal Windows application is with the content dialog, right? So you have to create the content dialog, set properties, tell it to show, and so on and so forth. Well, that's the kind of code, if you end up writing that in multiple spots, very quickly a little light bulb should go on in the back of your head saying, hey, code reuse, right? Dry, don't repeat yourself, right? Why don't I centralize this somewhere and make it into something more flexible for me to call, okay? So that's the first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to throw in a couple of, again, trying to be good and not to get away with too much global sort of implications here. Notice that they're static again, right? And that way as well I can just call them from the app object, right, without having to instantiate an app, okay? So I'm just making my own little show message here where I pass in a title and a message itself, okay? So that just basically builds my content dialog using the two values passed in. So this is for a simple message. OK is the only button we need, right? And we just show it async and away we go. So that gives us our basic way to, from now on, just call show message whenever I want to just pop up a message to the user, and all they have to do is acknowledge it, right? Now the other situation that we have is to actually create, I'm going to include my comments this time, so I'll just replace the whole thing. Okay, this one instead is asking a question, right? Like a yes, no. So just a little bit of control period work here. for threading tasks, right? Okay, so this is our confirm dialog. Okay, I stole that name from other applications where you see that kind of thing done, right? So again, we pass our title and our message. The only difference is we're actually going to return the value that they've selected, OK or cancel, right? Yes, no, whatever you wanted to call them, you could change the code here for it. So the idea here is if I want to ask them a question and get their response back, I can put this in one spot in code here and just reuse it from multiple locations throughout my application, right? So that's basically just using the content dialog box again. This time the primary button is no, the secondary is yes. There's a little point to talk about there. That's always good practice, right? Never have yes or the affirmative button be the default, right? Because you get some warning coming up to somebody. First thing they're going to do is panic and hit enter, right? Are you sure you want to delete this? You know, do you want to delete all of your work you've done for the last hour? Oh, and they hit yes, and you know, or just hit enter and they don't realize it. So you should always make no the default, right? Which is why I've got it set here that the primary button text is no and the secondary one is yes. Okay. All right. So just a little bit of plumbing work to do in the background so we can make use of some code reuse. Don't repeating ourselves each and every place we need to. All right. So that's good. I'll close this one for now. Yes, thank you. And it never hurts to do a build. Catch my errors as soon as possible. Okay. All right. Succeeded. So just planning ahead. Next, I'm going to come back and do some more work on the main page because it has to have a bit more thought given into it. But the main thing I'm going to be adding now is a page to focus on the details of a single object. In this case, we're working with employees. That's the entire focus of our little application at the moment. So one employee at a time. The nice thing about that is, okay, if it's broken down into all the key properties for a employee, well, then we can reuse the same page, whether we're updating an employee, inserting a new employee, right? And even we can put an option on there to delete from this page as well, showing them all the details before they decide to delete, right? So that's what I'll do is I'll add a new page right now. So just right click up here, right click, come on, add a new item. Okay, so XAML, a blank page, but I'm going to call it employee detail page. Probably page is overkill, but nonetheless, employee detail page. All right, just checking my spelling. Okay. Okay, so I have the two pages open now, and that's where I'm going to be doing a lot of the work is synchronizing how they work together and so on and so forth. So for the moment, just coming back to the main page for a minute, some of the text that I used here, I'm going to replace a little bit. We're going to add a row, okay, to the row definitions of the main grid, just because I want to put some buttons across the bottom, right? So I'll do that. I'll add a another row definition. Height equals auto. Okay, so that just gives me another row to do. And where I put this code doesn't really matter, right? But I'm going to throw in a relative panel going into that row. You know, just to drive the point home, I'll put it right after this stack panel. Although it could go above it, it wouldn't really matter because I'm designating the row it goes into with grid.row anyway, right? So I'm going to use a relative panel in this bottom row of the main grid on the page, just so I can keep this button centered, right? It's just an easy way to do it. Okay, so I have a button here, button add, right? The content is just the words add employee. Okay, so this way when I click this button, I will be able to bring up so to speak, the employee details page in the proper mode for adding a new one. Okay, so obviously then I need an event handler as well. Okay, my button click event, so if I come over here, make sure it's created properly, just double click it, and in the code behind page it will create the stub for the actual event handler. Okay, so there's that relative panel. The stack panel for the title, in hindsight, I think I was a little generous in the amount of margin space and so on. I just want to tighten it up a little bit. So I've got a slight variation I'm going to replace it with. Plus, I threw in a rectangle. Why a rectangle? Well, I wanted just a nice visual divider, right? And a rectangle is nice. You can just set the width so thin that it looks like just a thick line. So I find it works fairly well, right? Horizontal alignment is stretched, so it'll just fill the whole top from left to right, and away we go. All right, so that's the main changes to the main grid there, okay? Now the list box, okay? We talked the other day about the fact that our list box, sure, nice simple control, easy to utilize, but you know the problem is it's certainly not responsive. You don't get sort of cards looking of data filling the screen on a larger monitor and things like that. It works fine on a mobile and so on. So we're going to replace the list box with another control. Okay, there you can easily find the references in our online tutorial, book tutorial, for the grid view. Grid view is really nice because it's responsive. It'll expand out. Again, we'll create a template for each item, but it'll expand out and fill the screen with this grid of cells, so to speak, but then it'll just rearrange itself as the screen requires for smaller devices and so on. Now, in order to use the grid view, I stuck with the list view the other day. I could put it all in one set of code, embed everything here, but it gets really big and messy and it's kind of hard to read. So often, if there's a chunk of code that kind of stands on its own and be utilized in one or other locations, we'll actually add it to the page as a resource. Okay? You'll see as you go through the other tutorials why it's often very helpful to create page resources, and then you can even create resources that are not just belonging to the page. But I'm going to do this one at the top of the page. So this actually goes right here before we start the background. The grid, sorry. So as a page resource, I'm just defining a data template. And then I can call this data template possibly from multiple controls in some situations. I only have one to use it, but still it separates it out. It's just so much code to embed inside each other. It's nice to put it separately for easier maintenance and so on, right? So it's just a data template, again using my data namespace to specify the employee class. That's the model that this data template will use, right? So it is essentially the same full name and position that I had before, but now I'm putting this inside of just a general data template as a page resource. That just simplifies the code when I get down here to work in the actual list box, right? Okay, so the list box I will replace and just put a nice simple grid view. It'll look a lot smaller because I got rid of the data template aspect, right? So there we go. So with the grid view itself, that's a bit big, okay? It's going in the same row that the list was. Again, setting a little bit of margin. There's my item click, employee grid view item click. So let me just make sure I have code for that. Okay. All right. And you see, so the item template is my static resource employee data template. So that's the one I defined up here, right? That's my employee data template. So it's just a nice way to show that you can, instead of having all the code clouding the vision, right, you can just separate it out a little bit there with a bit of organization that way. Okay. Now, the code behind page, I've got to do some changes here as well because, of course, there's no more employee list and so on. I think what I'm going to do, though, is I'm just going to grab all the code for the new version and put it in place, and we'll talk about it. So I'll just grab all of this, except for the namespace. And replace it. Okay. Give it a second here. It should figure out what I've done after a moment or two. Try a build just to make sure if gives the oh, okay. I did have a little something. Oh, I think oh, that's the constructor. Ah. Okay, I wasn't supposed to replace that. Sorry, just the content. Okay, my apologies. Give me one sec. Okay, so I will use the shift and arrow to help me make sure I'm doing the right amount. There, I think that's it. And I'll do a build just to make sure I'm not missing a curly brace or I have one too many, which is easily done. Okay. Oh, that's just a namespace I'm missing. By the way, I threw this in. I decided that I want to just keep it in landscape mode, or sorry, portrait mode, right? So if I don't want it to rotate the screen just yet, okay, then all I have to do is add this one line of code to prevent rotating. Basically, the allowed display orientations consists of entirely portrait, right? Now, to use this, I have to add a using for Windows Graphics Display. There we go. And was that my only error? No, I have another error. Department repository, did I? Oh, that's that typo. I have a typo here for department repository. One or the other is spelled wrong. Sorry, I had a typo in my code here for department repository. At some point I spelled it wrong. Okay. All right, so I think that's our last build error. I'll just do one more to make sure. And then let's talk about the code and the changes we've made. So, starting from the top, right, so that one line just keeps it in portrait mode even if you turn your phone sideways. This works better for the page that way. Show employees, we call that on page loaded, right, the same as we did before. There's my fill drop down. Now the only thing I've done here that's a little different, right, is utilizing that department list that I've stored in the app object itself, right? So we added a bit of code here. So we go and get the departments, right? We add my artificially created department 0, okay, for the all option. And then before I actually assign it to the item source of the Combobox, I'm just going to actually store it as active departments, right? And because it's not static, I actually have to instantiate the app object first, and then I can add it into the app object. But it gives me a central place to stick it, and I can access it from there. So that just loads it when I first refresh this and get the departments from the web service. Other than that, this is the same. I'm ordering by the name so that the all option bubbles to the top with the space at the front. Okay, so show employees. This is, I think, exactly the same code we had, right? We're just setting the item source. The only difference is it's the grid view instead of the list view, right? Other than that, it's exactly the same. We just check if we actually have a department to filter by, calling the appropriate method of our repository, right? Depending on what we want. Get employees by department or just get all employees. Okay, so here's our item click for the grid view, right? So the idea here is we're actually going to do some navigation. So if I, with my finger or mouse or in any other way, basically select one of the items in the grid view, it'll trigger this event. And the idea is the user naturally will touch somebody if they want to see the details, right? Or edit them, okay? So it will navigate to the employee detail page, right? And passing as a parameter in the navigation the actual employee object. So that's nice, right? We're just pulling out of the clicked item, which we know how these lists work. Every item in a list is actually an object, right? So we cast it as an employee, and we pass that as the parameter to the employee detail page. That's why it's good to look at this code before we look at the code that receives it, right? So we'll find there, we look, when we navigate to the page, we look for an employee being passed as an object, and then we know which employee we're going to work with, right? Okay. That's just our selection change for the drop-down list to apply our filters. Yeah, that's the same code as we had the other day. Now here's for our little add button. This is the one we threw in the relative panel at the bottom of the main page. So the idea here is we're going to click this if we want to go and add a new employee, right? So we create a new blank employee object, right? Just instantiate a new employee. I'm setting the start date. I've got a note here. I found that in order for it to work properly, it had to have a value, right? So I just used today's date. After all, it is. You're creating a new employee, so as a best guess, they're probably starting work today. Otherwise, you can just change it, right? No big deal. But I had to have something there for X binding. When I was just using the older form of binding, it didn't care. I didn't actually even have to have a value. But X binding doesn't like null value for a date time. So that's why I have that note there. So basically, it's a simple idea, though. We create a blank employee, and then I call the exact same line of code navigating to my employee detail page, passing this new employee object that I just created. So you notice the logic here. I end up at the employee details page with an employee in tow. It's actually a real one that I'm editing because I clicked on that item in the grid view, or it's a brand new one that I've artificially created, ready to add once all the data is actually filled in, first names and last names and so on. So that should be basically it for our main page. I'll just do a save and a build, make sure we aren't too far off. I didn't even want to do a build. I'll tell it to rebuild then. Okay, there we go. You didn't see a need to build. All right. So let me, I'll leave that there. We'll come back here to the employee page for now, right? So this at the moment is pretty well blank, okay? I haven't got much of anything in it. Oh, can't even see the design screen. There we are. Come on, little guy. There you go. All right. So to focus on this, now this one, again, is going to be the XAML for all the details of one individual employee, right? So what do we have to add? Well, I have to add my namespace for the models, right? Just like we did the other day. So I'll add that in, that XML namespace. And I'm going to add a page resource. Now what is this about? Okay, I should add the classes so that we actually can see it. Hang on one second. Okay, converters are there when we want to use binding, and of course if everything was text, we'd never need to convert anything, right? Because text is text, it just copies around back and forth. But you know, when you want to take text and convert it, you know, to dates and back and forth and things like that, often we have to write our own little converter to make sure that that process happens properly, and we use the converter as part of the binding expression. So we can say bind to this such and such a date to our calendar control, for example, and it has to convert it from perhaps a string representation of a date into something like a time span or something like that. You know, different situations call for different conversions. So as part of the binding expression, we just supply the converter that does the job that we need going both directions. So what we'll often do is we'll organize these. I'm going to make a subdirectory, just call it converters, where we can add all the converters that we might need. And if you find later on you need another one, just go ahead and add it, okay? So first of all, just add the converters folder. add a new folder, which I'll just call converters. Oh. Okay. And inside there, I'll add a class. And I will call it, as a very creative name, datetime to offset converter. Why do I need this? Well, what we'll find is our little calendar control requires basically a offset, datetime offset, right? And of course, we probably have a datetime data type coming from the database. So we have to be able to convert back and forth in order to directly bind the data in the calendar control to the field in the property of the object. So if it's going to be this, well, I can make it public first of all. Class, right? Now, in order to make this work properly, thankfully, somebody planned ahead and said, you know, whenever you need one of these, we should define a, I don't know, how about an interface? Sure enough, there's an interface for how these converters should be implemented. So that's what I'll do, is I will say I want to implement I-value converter. Okay. Now saying, wait a second, can't find it. Thank you. We need a using for Windows UI XAML.data. Okay, so now it understands the namespace, but of course the next control period help will be to implement the interface. Just as we implemented our repository interfaces we created ourselves the other day. Okay, I just did the same trick here to get the structure in place for implementing this interface. Of course, it actually just throws exceptions right now. But you see how the idea is here. It has two methods, convert and convert back, right? Where you're set up to receive the object itself, right? There's a target type, a parameter, and a string, okay? As well as language, so you can use these quite extensively if you even want to, you know, make it for work in different regions. You can check for what region you're in. So if the currency system is, you know, different in some part of the world from another, you can automatically handle that in your converters as well. So you can expand as much smarts into this as required. But basically, ours is fairly straightforward for us. We just need to convert a datetime to a datetime offset and back and forth. So I'm going to do that with a try catch, good practice, right? So when we convert, basically I get my value. Now if it's null, I'll just return null. That's it, I'm done. Boom, out of there, right? It doesn't even go to the next line of code. If I do have a value, right, I will cast that value as a datetime and store it in date, right? And then I will return a new datetime offset passing that date to it. So that allows the conversion in the one direction, right? The exception here is if for some reason it can't convert it, maybe there's some sort of invalid date value somehow got into the system or something like that, or the user typed something in and I'm trying to convert it, because I can't type it in if I bind it to a calendar picker of sorts. But anyway, for some reason there's an exception, I'll just return datetime offset dot min value. Got to return something so that works, right? Satisfies the requirements. Okay, now to convert back, very much just the reverse process. Okay, again, good practice to use try catch here. I don't want to have it break in the middle of a conversion. So again, if the value going back is null, right, then I just return null. Otherwise, I create a datetime offset object, pulling the value and casting it as a datetime offset, and then I just return, it has a .datetime property built into a datetime offset. So that handles the conversion going back the other way. Again, I'll just use .min value, although of course this time I'm returning a datetime. So I can take a datetime offset, convert to datetime, and vice versa by using this value converter. Okay. This one, the next converter, by the way, I found that code online. I said, hey, I need a converter, and did a quick search in Bing, and I found it very quickly. I could have written my own, but hey, right? There you go. So I'm just going to add another class here. This one will be my currency to string converter, and actually I take credit for this one. I like to show, you know, when something is money, I like to show it with the dollar signs and the commas and everything, right, in the display. But of course, when people edit, okay, you're going to get all kinds of errors if you try to just convert that string to some sort of a decimal or something like that. So what I did is I thought, well, why not make a nice little converter that would have let me to automatically format a decimal to look like currency, but then also go the other way. So here's my currency to string converter, so I'll implement my iValue converter again. Converter. Better make that public as well. And I have to add, first of all, control period for the using, and then control period to implement it, right? Get the basic structure here going. All right, so the code I wrote myself this time, now that I learned a little bit about how these converters work, these value converters, right? Again, if I get null, then I'll return an empty string, right? It's got to be a string to work properly. So if I have a null value, I'll return an empty string. That works fine. Otherwise, I will actually just do a string.format, making it look like currency, which gives me nice dollar sign and commas at the thousands and so on, showing 2 decimal places. So it's just like a way to format the value for display on the screen. Okay, now going back the other way, notice my catch is just, hey, it didn't work, well, just return null. Okay, going the other then, so I already have something that looks like a currency value as a string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that value and just first of all replace all the dollar signs with nothing, with an empty string, and then take what's left and then replace any commas, right? So this is clearly not compatible with different regions, because in some regions of the world they use commas where we use a decimal point to indicate dollars versus cents, right? But this works for our North American application, and that's as far as if that's as far as I plan on rolling this out, then this is good enough. So I just strips out all the unwanted characters, and then finally lets me do system.convert to decimal, okay, to actually get the decimal value from the string after I've cleaned it up. Okay, so there are my 2 converters. So going back to my employee detail page, I just have to add the namespace for my converters, right? So it'll be similar to this one. Oh yeah, I will call it, you can see here, converters is the name for this namespace I'm giving to the XAML of the page, and it's of course the dot converters folder. All right, so that should in a moment get rid of those red underlines or blue underlines there. Build succeeded. Good. All right. So just a couple of namespaces. I have some converters, so I'm just about ready to go. All right. So let's just go back up to my code here. I'm going to add. I'm going to replace the grid with my code. And we'll do a quick tour here. Okay, so starting at the top then, so here's my content panel, right? So it's my main grid, and grid row 1, okay. Oh, sorry, I missed my grid def. Oh no, I'm good. Okay. This root grid, sorry, just thought I missed a bit of code there, but we're okay. I don't have the code behind all the events written yet, but that's going to come in a moment. All right, so we have our layout root grid here. I'll come back and we'll talk about visual state managers later. But for now, I just have a couple of row definitions, an auto and a star, right? So I'll throw a stack panel here for the title, company application again, basically following the same approach as the main page, but this is employee, right? So I just have employee in nice big letters at the top, a rectangle, again to give me that separation, that line in the background. Okay. All right, so the main content panel then, right? I have my employee display grid is the name I'm giving this grid, and I have a number of column definitions because of course I have a lot of name value pairs here. If you prefer, you could rewrite a lot of this with stack panels, but I don't mind the grid as much as some people that we know, right? So basically what I have is a collection of text blocks and text boxes. Now, of course, the order these are in the XAML makes no difference because it's all specified by the grid rows and columns where they actually appear. But, you know, sometimes it's helpful to have them more or less in order. But you can see the look over here, right, that I actually have the label and then all the controls. So we have text boxes for things like first name, last name, and so on, right? Just going down a little bit further, something a bit more interesting then, department. So we have a text block for the label for the department, but there's our familiar combo box, right? So our combo box, okay, is very similar to the one on the main page, but of course this time it will always be bound, right? So the selected value is binding department ID mode 2-way, right? So when we select a department out of here, it can pass the department ID as the bound property, as the selected value. And that's what we use. Remember, although it's an object, that's great, but even when we seed data in one of our entity objects, right back when we did MVC, all we would usually do is set that foreign key, that integer value, in order to associate it with the parent object. So it's the same idea here. All right, now the next thing that gets quite interesting is our salary, right? So here I'm using my converter. So we're doing an X-bind. The view is our individual employee that we're looking at. The salary converter is our static resource currency to string converter. Again, mode is 2-way. So that's how it will display it, nicely formatted by our converter code, and then take that when it's binding and with the 2-way binding, writing out to the actual object itself. It will strip out the extra characters and store just the decimal value. Next one, the interesting one here, is our start date, right? The date picker. Okay, there's a number of controls we could choose from. This is a fairly easy one to use. I have a bit of extra code here just to specify a particular format. I like to show it in this way. You don't have to do this extra bit of work. You can just take the default format that it gives you, but I like to show the actual integer as a day and an abbreviated form of the day of the week. I just find it easier when I see that to know if it's Tuesday or Wednesday, right? But you don't want to take too much room on the screen. So that's an abbreviated way to do that for the day of the week. But the binding here, that's the actual date value of our date picker control. Is going to use X binding to our start date property of our view object, right? Again, calling our converter for the datetime offset converter. Okay. Then at the bottom I have a relative panel here for some buttons, right? So basically I got 3 buttons: button delete, button save, and button cancel, right? So, you know, if you're adding new, right, you can either click save or delete, or cancel. If it's an existing item, then we'd probably want to delete or cancel, right? So we'll see in code how we change which ones are actually available depending on the mode that this page is in. Are we in add mode or edit mode? All right, now for the code behind for this page then, Let me just come down here, grab the code behind file. And again, this is going to be a simpler exercise if I just grab all the code at once. And we'll tour it together. Okay. And I'll just do a build to make sure that everything is happy. So now I should be successful because I actually have the event handlers that were being called for in the XAML itself. All right. So our employee detail page, right? Notice at the class level here, I'm creating an object. It's an employee object. I'm just calling it view, right? So when we receive the employee that it's passed to the constructor for the page, we can grab this view and thereby this employee and just create it as the view for the whole page, right? So everything can be bound to the one employee. Again, I don't want it to go to landscape mode. I'm calling fill dropdown, right? Just so that we actually have data in our dropdown list. But this time, of course, I don't have to go back to the web service, right? Okay, so here's my on navigated to. So here's where we actually get our employee being passed in, right? So as we navigate to this page, we receive the E parameter, which is a navigation event arg. So we grab the actual parameter from it, and because we know we gave an employee object, we know we can cast it out as an employee. And we store that as our view. So remember that was created at the class level, so our view object is now the employee that was sent here. Of course, that employee could be basically empty, could be a no employee with no data yet, other than the start date, or it's an existing employee with the data loaded from the database. All right, so just setting the data context of the page to our view, and away we go. By the way, if the employee ID is 0, that's my little trick for finding out which mode I'm in. Am I adding or am I editing, right? So when I receive on navigation, when I receive the employee, I can quickly check. If it's an existing employee that came from the database that I want to update or edit, they will already have an existing employee ID number. If it's a brand new one I just created for adding purposes, the employee ID will be 0, right? Because integers get 0 as a default value. That just lets me find out. So yeah, I want to disable the delete button if I'm adding, right? No point trying to delete it because we haven't actually saved it anywhere yet. So I just set the is enabled property to false. Okay. So then we have our properties, our events here for the different buttons. So if we decide, okay, we've finished, we're happy, we're going to save our employee, I click my save button. Now here I'm doing some sort of old-fashioned validation, right? It'd be nice if this system would just automatically use our data annotations and do all the validators for us, but sorry. This is not an MVC web application type situation here, right? So we actually have to think about our own. This is our poor man's approach. We've done this code right back when you first learned JavaScript. You did this kind of code to make sure that your pizza order form was filled out properly, if you remember that exercise. Okay, anyway. Right, so I'm just calling is employee valid, right? So I have my own little code I wrote to check for certain things. I won't actually check for absolutely everything. And it'll return true or false. I pass in the current view. And that's the beauty of it, right? The binding is working for us. All the controls are bound to the different properties of the view or employee object, so I don't have to worry about populating or moving data from the XAML form, so to speak, into the object. The binding looks after all that. I just pass the view object itself, and boom, it has all the data that's entered in the form. So it'll return true or false if it's valid, and of course it also has an out parameter here to give me a message specifying what's wrong, what needs to be fixed, right? So we'll get to that in a minute. But basically if it's valid, then I can try saving it, right? That's what we asked it to do. Okay. I set the department to null because otherwise if it's populated with an actual department object, then it causes a problem later on, right? We'll instantiate an employee repository. If we're adding, then I call my add employee, right? If we're updating, I call update employee. Notice we aren't setting department ID to null, right? It's just the ID, right? The ID is fine, it's the integer, but we don't want to have an eagerly loaded actual department in it as well. Okay. Frame, go back. Well, that's an easy way to navigate back to the main page, right? Okay. App show message, error saving employee. So we don't go back to the main page unless we successfully saved. We can actually show a message. So I'm calling my show message method of the app object. That's a little bit of code we added there to make it dry, right? The else, invalid values, and then along with that we'll give our full detail of all the errors that we found on the page itself, creating the employee. So it's similar to the kind of code we've written before, which is why I did it this way, so it's easy to understand, right? There's my is employee valid, my own little true or false. Okay, so it's a Boolean, right? We pass an employee in. I have my string for errors, my out parameter there to pass back a string listing all the errors. So this is the exact way we wrote our first JavaScript validation when we did it together in class, right? I start off assuming that everything is good, and I do test after test after test. If it fails any one test, then my assumption is wrong, and my data valid Boolean is now going to be set to false. So I start off assuming everything's good, test whatever I need to, right? By the way, it's just an initialization of a little bit of text for the top of the message. So I just do if, right? So if is null or white space the first name, well, hey, it's required. So I just give that feedback, set valid to false, and so on and so forth. Same thing for the last name. Same thing for the job title. Job title is required, right? And away we go. The only thing for the department ID, if the ID is 0, then they didn't assign a department, right? So make sure that that is done. And that's it. That's all I decided to check for. Okay, dates can be null in this system, so it's not a big deal. Return data valid. It'll be true or false. Okay, so that gets called whenever we save, right? Whether we're editing or adding a new record. Fill dropdown, of course, we called that earlier, but this time instead of actually instantiating a repository object and going to get it from the web API, I'm just pulling it out of the app object, right? So I instantiate a copy of the app object, grab the active departments out of this app, and away we go. I just add the item source of the combo box, and away we go. All right. Oh, notice I have a where clause here. I don't want to show my all option, right? So that just filters it out, because where department ID is greater than 0, I know I set it to 0, so it just won't have the all option, but it'll still have the order by, so it's alphabetically ordered. Okay, what happens when we ask to delete? Well, remember, this is disabled when we're adding new, so this is only going to be available if I've passed an existing employee to update, right? Okay, so one thing I want to do is confirm. So I'll make use of that confirm dialog code that I added to my app object, right? The title will be confirm delete. Are you certain you want to delete? I can grab the full name from the view object, the employee itself, right, in my part of my message. So I get the result from my confirm dialog. Notice the data type of the result is a content dialog result. And I just do an if. Decide, okay. If it is the secondary result, right? In other words, yes. Remember, the primary result was no, don't delete. So the secondary result is yes. So then I'll actually, again, you have to set the department to null in case there was something there as an object. Call up my repository and just call my delete employee, passing the employee object to it. Bada bing, bada boom, go back to the main page because you're done deleting. Exception, error deleting employee. Cancel, well, basically just don't do anything, just go back. That's the easiest one of all, okay? All right, so I think we've got all the code in place for the most part here. The only thing we might need, let me just double check. Well, okay, so just testing it out so far, you can see the effect, right? Using the grid view, now we get nice columns of data each, you know, if you want to put a border around it or change colors and so on, if you want to get fancier graphically, you can make each one look like a little index card if you really wanted to or something like that, right? And then you can scroll up and down, away you go. Of course, on a smaller device or narrower device, being a responsive control, right, it'll just give you fewer and fewer columns until you're down to what you would see on a mobile device as well. And of course, our filtering should work, so if I just want to see information systems employees, there we go, back again, and we're good, right? So there we go. Now let's try adding an employee. There we go. So now we've navigated to our employee page. Remember, we created an empty employee object, navigated it, passed it in our navigation. So we've actually created it, but until we save it, it doesn't exist anywhere but in memory, right? If I click Save Now, there's my confirm, or my message, so my warning message, right? First name required, last name, job title must be assigned to a department. Okay. Jimmy, last name, job title, welder, department. Welders all work in human resources, don't they? Okay, what kind of salary should we give them? $500. Okay, $50,000 a year. And start date, notice it has today's date, right? There's that little Thursday showing there, okay, just from the extra little bit of formatting I added. How this works is you can scroll up and down. By the way, you can set minimum, maximum values that you can't go past. It doesn't hide them, but it just grays them out, right? So no, he's not going to start till tomorrow on Friday. So I'll select that. Notice there's a check box and an X down here. It won't actually apply the change I made till I check the checkbox, right? So I can save this, and if my code works, there we see, okay? So if I pulled the data right from the WebApi, I should see that we've actually added the record. I know that because it actually went to the database and refreshed this list anyway. If I want to edit that, because, oh, you know what? We only offered him $45,000. Now he's going to have to wait 6 months before he gets that first raise. So I'll just click Save. Now, of course, I'm not showing that data here, but if I bring up details on Yun, I see that it did actually correctly save. So everything seems to be pretty much working. Add new and so on. Now, there's a bit of an issue, like cancel is fine, right? Let's try testing our delete. So I want to delete this guy, so I can notice the delete was grayed out when I was adding new, but now delete is here. There's my confirm. Are you certain that you want to delete? Yes. And we go back and he's gone from the list, right? So it looks like all of our CRUD is actually working. One issue that we have, though, if I bring this up on the phone, right? Let me do that. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so here's our chance. So we see it running on the mobile device. Notice that if I rotate, it doesn't change orientation. It just says, hey, what are you doing? Go on, hold me upright so you can read me properly. Okay, put it back again. But we can flick, okay, through all the employees. I can filter just for one group or another. Marketing. Go back again to all. Where we go, right? If I click on anybody like Dave Brown here in accounting, it brings up Dave Brown. So it's working, you see, pretty much exactly the same as what we expected to see on the full application. But here's an issue. The phone has this little guy down here, a back button, right? If I click the back button, anybody can guess what will happen?
Close the app.
Yeah, it closes the app, right? So, you don't have a back button when I run the same thing in the local system, right? I'm going to go back to local machine. Oh, no. Stop. Okay, so here I have it running in both. Now you might say, well, wait a second, it might be nice to actually have a back button here as well, right? We saw that implemented with our simple little hamburger approach that we did in Lab 1, right? So that if I actually go to Dave Brown here, that I might have a back button instead of, I can just cancel, which kind of gives me the same thing. But you know, it's just been an issue that people complained about with the earlier version of Universal Windows apps, that, you know, how do you handle this back button issue for devices that have it built in? You can't avoid it. But, you know, on the other hand, it might be nice to have it on something that doesn't have a built-in back button and back and forth between the two arguments. So that'll be our next little thing, is we're going to see, oh, maybe I should prove, right? Dave Brown in accounting, he's a clerk. We'll give him a job title of head clerk. Save that. Right? Now, it doesn't get notified of a change here, but the next time this refreshes for any reason, even if I just change to the accounting department, I see it updated the data. So two separate apps running on two separate devices, but obviously because we have a common web API, right, we can actually have changes done in one show up in the other and vice versa. Okay, so let's get into this business of the back button and how we can solve that. All right. Okay, so the first change we're going to do is down here in the, this is all going to happen in our app XAML here, right? So there's the onLaunched event, and that's where we set up certain aspects like defining the root frame, okay, and so on, and what page will be initially loaded and things like that. All right, so I'm going to stick it right here after this adding the navigation failed event. I'm going to throw in a little bit of extra code. Okay, I'm going to add a onNavigated, right? Now, of course, it's going to complain because it's not created yet. Thank you very much. Please generate the method for me. Good. By the way, I'm going to throw some comments in here. So when you get this code, when you download my little sample, if you want to learn more, I have right in the comment here. This is an excellent article that talks about this approach and how it'll probably eventually be put in the default scaffolding, because who doesn't want to have this nice automated system for back buttons available, right? Okay, added for the back button. So we added that event, and of course we'll actually have to put some code in that event, right? So one more thing we'll do here. So just before we leave this event, the onLaunched event, a little bit more work to do here. Okay. We need to register a handler for back request events, right? Setting the visibility of a back button that we're going to automatically add to every page that might want one. Okay, so again, there's a couple usings needed here. We'll just quickly add Windows UI Core. Now, oh, that's just the onBack requested, right? So we'll actually get that event in just a second here. Okay. Okay, so I'll just let it help me with this one as well. All right. So I need to actually put some code into those, so they're down here on back requested and on navigated, right? So let me just throw this in. So for on navigation failed, sorry, I meant the on back requested, right? So instead of not implemented, this is what we're going to do here, right? So we're going to basically grab the root frame as the current frame. If it can go back, okay, then I decided to just confirm, right? In case they've started to modify, they might not realize that going back will actually cancel any changes without saving. So I decided to stop them and say, are you certain you want to leave this page? Any changes you've made will be lost, right? And then depending on what they answer, yes or no, will actually allow the go back to happen, right? Okay, I have to make that async in order to do that. There we go. Right, because of the await for the confirm dialog. All right, so that is the one. Now the other was our on navigated, right? So for on navigated, what we're going to do every time a navigation event occurs, we're going to update the back button's visibility, right? So we're going to get for the current view, okay, the visibility can go back. So either we set it visible or collapse, depending on the situation. All right, so let's see the effect. Let me run it on the local machine. So now if I click Tim Brown, notice it's automatically added a back button. Yay! All that work in code. Just to get that little back button. Now this is the extra bit of code I put in. You could refine this to try and determine if the term often used in design is if the record is dirty. Now this is not a Donald Trump comment, okay? A record being dirty or an object being dirty means that there are pending changes that haven't been saved, right? If it's still clean, then it still has all the original data values stored in all its properties. So that term's been around and used in software development for years. I'm not the first one, so don't blame me if it sounds rude, okay? We could write some code to try and check for that, because really I haven't changed anything. It's just warning me if I have, any changes will not be saved, right? If I say no, then it won't let me just use the back button. It'll keep coming up with that error. If I say yes, go back, then it goes back, right? Same thing for add employee. Automatically generates the back button for me. And again though, right, if I've started to make changes here and decided, well, I don't want to save it, it just says, are you sure you want to confirm that cancel operation? Yes. And we don't save. Of course, I could have just clicked the cancel button too, but you know, since we're putting a back arrow up there, we want to make sure it's used intelligently, and we warn people of the possibility of losing data if you just simply navigate away, right? All right. So to show you how that works on the phone, I actually have to run it on the phone again. Give me one sec. Shouldn't take very long because we actually have the phone still running. Make sure I pick the same one. Okay. So it's uploaded the new version. So now if I go into Dave Brown here and use the phone's own back button, are you sure you want to leave? Yes. And instead of closing the application, I just navigate back, okay, one frame, or to the main page in this case. So much better user experience now on a mobile device that has a built-in hardware back button. And at the same time, that little bit of code we put in, it was kind of painful watching me find the right code, right? But that tutorial explains it all step by step. The advantage there is that the local application running on a full PC now actually has a nice back button showing up as well. So that's it. That's the end of our little demo. So I'll get this code posted. Any questions finally before we flick, flick, flick? Okay, very good.